My name is Gabriel Melendez, Director of the Center for Regional Studies at the University of New Mexico. I would like to welcome you all to one of our programs in the La Canoa Legacy Series, a partnership between the National Hispanic Cultural Center and the Center for Regional Studies. The Center for Regional Studies is dedicated to the creation and dissemination of knowledge about New Mexico, the Greater Southwest as a region, and its connections to northern Mexico, Latin America, and the Iberian Peninsula. The La Canoa Legacy Series takes its inspiration from the word canoa. A canoa is a sloop-rigged fishing boat, common in the Amazon, but in New Mexico it is the name of some common everyday tools, a simple canal or flute, or the wooden paddle a baker uses to move loaves of bread in and out of a hot oven. Always La Canoa receives and transports people and resources. And we want these talks to transport us and move the conversation between presenters and audience members back and forth in rich dialogue. We also want our talks to bring practical, useful information to community members, researchers, and others interested in the history, culture, politics, sociology, and religious experiences of our region.
I'd like to begin with an introduction of a tool. This is a planning tool that we use with, it's a measure of feasibility. And Ian Mihar was one of the famous urban planners. He was also an ecologist, and his Multiply and Subdue the Earth, which I have there as a 1969 film, is available on YouTube if you're interested in what a land suitability analysis entails. His film is great, and it has some very interesting intricacies, connections with New Mexico. So Ian really was at the heart of a concept that later became known as GIS, the Geographic Information System, which is different than GPS. GPS is what you use when you navigate and you want to get from A to B and you're wanting to know where you are. It's one plane of many of the layers. So Ian was thinking, this would be great if we could figure out what type of planning and development, what new projects should go in a particular location with regards to what's happening on all the layers. So he envisioned something like an onion peel, where you can see through an onion peel. Or for those of you that remember the old-fashioned projectors with the plastics, and then people overlaid plastics over plastics, and then they drew over some of those plastics to create layers. And all those layers combined really said something else, right? They were factors which were multiplied. Something like this. And behind Ian's idea was that there were main components: water, how water is moving through our system, whether it be through the air, through the land, underground, and time being major factors, major important factors. The types of land. So what type of land are we sitting on, and how is it changing, and what is the time frame that it changes based upon all the other things that are going on? That's a very important concept. Of course, roads is at the top of this layer, being that we are altering the physiography very quickly on this top layer, but we've got many other layers of importance underneath that should go into the planning. A land suitability analysis, which you can't really see, are based upon components, factors such as historical values, their scenic values, recreation values, residential values, water, forest, wildlife, and institutional. This is just certain layers that could be overlapped. If you're thinking about where to develop a great housing project, you might want to look at what type of bedrock the housing project is going to go on. What type of soil? Is it going to subside? Are there slope aspects? Is it in a susceptible place of erosion? What's the foundation? Is there a floodplain? All those factors are important, right? Just as that, I'm going to take you through a few slides, and I want you to keep in mind, as we look at these, how can we overlay concepts of layers of importance, historical values, cultural values, into our planning program. So keep your mind open. These are just to give you some food for thought. And what might help you keep in mind when we're looking at a big map of the United States, find a point of interest and keep your eyes on that point and see what factors are overlapping and what that means. So with infrastructure, this is not just roads. We think of infrastructure as everything that's on the built environment, but we forget that there's a whole layer of infrastructure that's very old and dated underneath us. That's a layer within our mind that we need to keep, as well as the areas which have nothing on it, right? There are places, those green blobs, that folks see, wow, there's a lot of potential that we could do with those open spaces. And there are other folks that say there's a lot of potential for keeping it as open space and for preserving the fact that there's nothing on there, because there are things on there, right, that might be of importance. We have systems that we don't see anymore that are still here. And what's great about the Santa Fe Trail, the Camino Real, is that we can see it with aerial photography. The old roads, the ruts that wagons once took, those layers are still there, even though we may not be able to see them quite so clearly. There are layers that we don't see that are very important too. And are they stakeholders that should be at the table? Who's advocating for them, right? There are ecological functions that we need, maybe buffers, maybe places of importance that give us things that we have, that we place a value on, that are very important. That's a layer. There are layers where this is the light that's emitted at night from cities. And if you notice where we're at, we don't have a lot. And that may be a good thing to some folks. And it may also be important to organisms that we are not necessarily thinking about, right? So we need to find out who lives here. Is that important to maybe having tourism with stargazing here in our own backyard? Is that important to us? Do we really want to look like the other places? And what does that do to our environment and the organisms that live here? Oops. Sorry. Okay, how about this one? This comes up a lot, right? And I want to just put this through a lens of, when you look at maps like this, have in your mind the critical race theory as a lens. What is this saying and why? Is it important? When you look at places, what's happening, right? We have people here that are transient, that have lived here for a long time, and then we have issues that are going on. What are those? Why, right? Notice that the regions in red are some of the most rural populated areas, or lack of populated, right? Because they're in rural areas. Does that have a factor with what's going on here in this map and what it's telling us? What about this one, right? Notice that the areas in the darkest blue happen to be where the plantations used to be, where the cornfields are. Does that have any factor? Should we question, should we include this in the decisions that we're making and what's happening when we look at public health and environmental factors? Remember, those same areas that were in blue happen to be the same areas in this case again. We can't really say that there's a correlation. That would be wrong, but we have to question. This one says some interesting things as well, right? Where are those places? What's happening there and why? When we start looking into our own backyard, we start looking at factors of health disparities, of economic insecurity, if you want to call it that, where places are that have been hit with environmental contamination. When I look at this map, I see places where the poorest communities live, and there's also the ethnic background. So San Miguel Mora is highly Hispanic communities, Socorro as well, Catron. San Juan, McKinley counties have the most population of indigenous communities. But the reality of the situation is that we're all intermixed. And the folks that are in the rural populations, who is advocating for them, what's happening in their backyard, and is it environmental justice is a question. Injustice. This is a map of abandoned uranium mines. And we'll go into some of the policies that are placed. I just want you to see what's happening in your own backyard. Are you aware that so many exist? Where and why? And when we tick back to exactly where we are at our particular place, do you see necessarily that we're connected to the greater system? That what we're doing affects people downstream from us, and what's happening upstream also comes down our channel and filters into what processes, maybe goes down into the water table, maybe affects the community on the other side of the hill. I want to frame this discussion with some policy so that you see that the history of doctrine was indoctrinated into the United States and has become what caused the removal, what caused the transformation of land use within New Mexico. The taking of land, the removal, the relocation, the assimilation is still going on today. I don't say that there's colonization because indigenous people still exist. We're here. We weren't colonized. We weren't eradicated. But these policies of removal and assimilation are still continuing. The mining law is an issue because mining permits have continued to be issued, especially in regions like Mount Taylor, and we'll discuss that later. The Dawes Act was an indigenous act to try to separate communal lands. So communities owned parcels, and the parcels were given to families, and families broke them down however they wanted. No longer could take place with the Dawes Act. The Reorganization Act was something to move folks away from urban areas. Reservations were having problems, and people needed employment in other regions like California, and folks were reorganized to go into urban areas. That act is still going on today, I believe. And I also want to remind you that what has happened with the contact of European has been very devastating to populations here in New Mexico. There was massive loss of life, gentrification, starvation, stolen women and children. They were forced into servitude, forced slavitude, or slaves. And there was also a backlash, right, from the indigenous community. So this painting from Ed Caboti, as well as Jason Garcia's work, it shows what happened with the Pueblo Revolt and the fact that people were tired of the practices, the policies that were imposed upon them, and retaliated. And where we are today, the bottom picture is literally where we are today. This is South Valley from 1930s sometime. This photo came from the New Mexico Center for Southwest Research. And I love it because here, when we look at the history of Barales and the South Valley, agriculture is starting to become important again, right? With conservation of traditions and these cultural practices that have tied us to the land, all great, except that this area has been severely contaminated. That isn't in the layer of history. It should be. Naranjo Morrises Numbewage is sitting on 19th and Mountain, if you want to drive by there. It's in front of the History Museum. And that is an interesting sculpture. It's a landscape architectural homage to the Pueblo ancestors. And she says that right there at that location was a summer camp for Pueblo people, different people. So the river kind of comes along pretty close to where the botanical garden is, and just to the south of that, where the museum sits, was their summer camp. Just kind of neat. And Numbewage, she wanted this piece to remind us to center ourselves. right? When we're at a place, we have a connection that's at the very core of our being, and that's which the place of respect and love and our core values is what is at the heart of the Pueblo communities, and that's what she was trying to relay. And this is also in Albuquerque's backyard, right? With now urban sprawl coming abrupt, right abut to the Petroglyph National Monument. This is a monument, and as you notice, there aren't any fencing. There isn't docents that are saying, whoa, let me tell you about this area and why it's culturally important. Let me tell you about the history. Because it's just a monument, and it's unregulated. At night, people come in and they vandalize. What happened in the picture at the bottom is somebody decided to chip away a beautiful piece and maybe place that in front of their yard or hawk it on eBay. And that's what's happening. They're seen as beautiful pictures. The mere fact that this particular piece was placed along a trail by the city of Albuquerque shows that there is a disconnect to what these really mean. So if you're interested in specifically the petroglyphs and what this area means, and a little bit more about Native science in general, Greg Cajete's book, he's a UNM professor, would be a place that I would point you to. Greg took a team of students and he went out and he GPS'd, positioned, figured out where these beautiful rocks were and started mapping them. And it was really as an act of preservation before they got vandalized, and this was over 10 years ago. And they have become even more vandalized from that time. But his idea was to map out as many as he could and figure out what were some of the meanings behind them. And the stark revelation was that they were mimicking the constellations. So people, not just anyone, was allowed to write on rocks. To create a petroglyph is actually a work within taking a rock and pecking on another rock. But it's very intentional. And only scientists, native observers, holy people were allowed to do this, not just anyone. Just as we have graffiti and vandalism laws back then, only certain people were allowed to come here. People came here, and people still continue to come here for religious purposes. This has not stopped. What's happening with Bandolier National Park? It might be a national park. That's why I say question mark in here. So I just read about a week ago that Senator Heinrich was bringing to Congress another bill. And what he wants to do is make Bandolier National Monument into a national park. The only other national park that we have is Carlsbad. This would be the second one if it passes in Congress. Why, I found was interesting. And I put up the article here if you want to look it up later. Martin Heinrich was thinking that this particular area, of course, Adolph Bandolier was who it was named for. Woodrow Wilson, I believe, is the one who created it in 1916. So the park has been around for a long time. It's a national treasure. If you don't know what Bandolier is, it's an ash tuff, a volcanic ash tuff that has been eroded and carved away and used as habitation. And the habitation by Pueblo ancestors occurred somewhere between 1150 to around 1600s. That was the occupation of Bandolier. Aside from that, the Pueblo people still are utilizing that area for religious and cultural purposes. And they're concerned because Bears Ears was recently, 2 years ago, reduced in size, right? Obama put protections on it, and then it was reduced. So the Pueblo folks got together and said, we're worried about Bandolier. It's a national monument, which doesn't mean that any oil and gas drilling can stop. Any fracking may happen within that national park if the government so dictates it. How do we preserve it? So Heinrich decides to to put it as a national park, which would have the highest protection. That would mean that within the boundaries of the park, there would be no oil or gas drilling or any sort of resource extraction. However, in order to do that, 4,000 acres would be given up to open space to allow for hunting in the north of Bandolier. And Heinrich would say, okay, if it becomes a national park, I have one stipulation, and that would be that you have tribal consultation on any planning and activities that happen within this national park. And you have to make sure that the Pueblo people and any indigenous nations have the right to continue their practices there. That's my stipulation. So we'll see if it passes. Keep your eyes peeled. There's also some interesting happenings around Chaco. This weekend, 5 congressional delegates from the National Resources Committee are coming in, and they're taking a tour of Chaco. They are meeting about the environmental justice around the groups that live in Chaco and around. And they're analyzing how can we make this National Historic Park protected. And what's on the table right now is to create a buffer, a 10-mile buffer around Chaco to protect it. However, there are people living within that 10-mile buffer that are doing drilling. That doesn't stop them. It doesn't stop the government unless it's a national park, and that's not been put on the table. So if you're interested in participating, listening on a hearing about Chaco, 10 a.m., Santa Fe, the capital. You can look online and listen in online to what people are saying, the hearing that's going to happen. Our governor is going to present the views of communities and what's happening and their stance upon what they want. And as far as I know, the only protection is a 10-mile buffer, but we'll see what happens. I also want to remind you of some of the other sacred sites. The Gila River, we forget where that's at, why that's important. It's one of the last wild rivers in the United States. And it's in a region that is really diverse. It actually has 3 different biological regions, and there are some fascinating organisms that live there. We forget also that there are 3 tribes, the Pima, the Tohono O'odham, there are the San Carlos Apaches, and other tribes that come through here utilizing the river, paying homage. That's their homelands. And I thought this picture, actually, I wanted to open up with this, looked like how the Rio Grande was around Barales, because Barales was the crossing point from where people came over from the east to the west side, right here. And so I envisioned that this is what that point of crossing looked like when wagons were coming across here in our backyard. So, the Gila. We forget that some of the historical layers are not just natives, and that Geronimo was born along this river long ago. We forget that there are literally endemic species, and just this whole sensitive endangered species like the loach minnow, and also important species like the Mexican gray wolf. So predators are really under attack within our state, if you don't know already, with coyote killing contests. And we forget that all these organisms help provide those values that we talked about earlier. And this region is wild for a reason. What is the threat here is off-roading. So people come through this area because no one's around, right? It's very remote. They want to come by a nice waterway and have fun on off-roading vehicles. With that comes the introduction of invasive species, non-native species. And it also comes with a pressure for upland farmers to want to divert water from the Gila, to dam it up and use it for agricultural purposes way before it even gets to this region. Those are the threats right now. And I want to bring this back to what Naranjo Morrises' comment was. This is an artist who who did the landscape sculpture and also has been a eco-activist. So she put this in front of the Arizona cholla plant. And I like her statement about, since the beginning of time, humans have been leaving marks on the land, from rock art carved by ancient peoples to interstate billboards advertising cheap gas. We humans have been leaving our mark at a different time, for different periods, for a variety of reasons. And her concept for putting up these protect the sacred is really about protecting sacredness of life, no matter who we are, or where we're from, or where we're going. And I wonder, do we really, what we're doing, what we're marking upon this land, do we really understand the implications behind that? When we look at the Rio Grande, are we understanding the implications of what's really there, right? And I wanted to put this component, I don't know if you can read it in the back, but the color, the clarity, the water, the smell, the taste, those are all indicators of water quality, right? According to an NPR report, 2013, kayakers in the Rio Grande near Laredo, Texas, found that the river was a chocolate brown color. We often see that today, right? With a pungent smell. And the water contained floating carcasses of dogs and dead fish. And I have friends who have lived on the border between Mexico and the United States, and they say that there are bodies that float through there as well. Dumping of many things. And I wonder, what exactly do you know that's being dumped? Right? We have right now another executive order. Actually, it's an alteration of the Clean Water Act that's in Congress, if you haven't heard about it. It's interesting because New Mexico would be the hardest hit state that it would affect. What the Clean Water Act wants to clarify is what waters it wants to keep clean. And what the definition of waters would be. So it would eliminate all ephemeral streams from the Clean Water Act, which means that only the Rio Grande, and maybe not even the Rio Grande because it doesn't run all the time. Ephemeral means intermittent, right? Only when it rains, only when there's water in the channel. And so that means deregulating, not having to issue permits or not having to oversight or to crack down on any people contaminating. Very big thing that's happening. If you want to make a comment about what's happening with the Clean Water Act, you have until April 15th to make a comment. So I encourage you to do so if you care so much about this issue. But look what's happening in our own backyard. This is Albuquerque, South Valley, if you don't recognize it. Mafka gave me this photo of trash. And I want to remind you that there are connections right here. People are still cleaning the ditch today in communities. This is actually the time for ditch cleaning. And the water that's coming from the Rio Grande is feeding agricultural areas, and it has been for a long time. This is something of what looks like the waffle gardens that existed for Pueblo communities thousands of years ago. They're the ones who figured out how to do dryland farming really well, and these waffle gardens were ingenious. Water from the Rio Grande goes into the Pueblo of Isleta, right from downstream. Let me read off Verna Olgenteller's statement because this is very important. The environmental issue is a very spiritual one, and I think that it takes the understanding and recognition that water and all natural resources are really spirits. Indian people recognize that, and so when those spirits are wounded or soiled, if you will, then it's very much a degradation of that particular spirit, and we're all paying for it. So it's very important that we recognize the power of these spirits. We have no control over them, and they are very powerful. And if we're not real careful about how we treat them, we may be seeing some very serious end to us, because the spirits can only put up with so much. They are very real, and I think that after a long time of being underground with our religion and many of our sacred beliefs, I think Pueblo people are finally becoming a little bit more open about it. We are beginning to share it a little bit more because we're finding that it's important that the world recognizes the spirituality of it all. profound statement. She made that at the Pioneers Conference. So here's a Rio Grande entering into Isleta Pueblo, and they divert water, and what looked like the little waffle farm is actually something that happens right in the heart of their pueblo. For thousands of years they've been cultivating in the plaza, and if you go down to Isleta, they still divert the water. However, Governor Oldenthaler put a stop after decades of people becoming sick from baptizing, immersing, right? Consuming water, using the water for farming, and people becoming sick. She told the elders, you have to stop. We have to do something about these issues first, and then we can continue. But let's first not have you be sick. And that is a huge impediment on religious rights in our country. So for now, those practices have stopped. And what's interesting is when I read this, she's saying it's now that Pueblo people are beginning to be a little bit more open. They weren't open before because of the history of the land use. Right? The subjugation, the way that the feast days have occurred is because of Christian input of colonization, right, so to speak. They're still here continuing their beliefs that went underground, their religion, and incorporated in many different ways. But because of what's happened with those policies, of how they were treated, how they had to revolt, right? The history of the revolt is so interesting. One, because the Pueblo people really understood what was happening in their ecology. They knew the timing of the rivers. They knew the movements of everything because they've lived here since time immemorial. And the other interesting point is that when Pope wanted to do this revolt, he wanted to revert back to pre-colonization, right? Let's everybody go back to before the cart and horse, right? How things used to be. We wanted to burn every artifact, every tree, and then some of the people who had already mixed, they said, whoa, wait a minute. We like prune pies. And these little oven things that give us those tasty biscochitos, those are really good. Maybe we shouldn't completely remove everything, right? And look what happened, right? We became immersed in both. So that's what's happening downstream from Albuquerque. What's happening upstream? We often forget about Los Alamos and the impact that that's had. The transportation of the actual bomb, that was it. That little block of uranium was a nuclear test. And then what you're seeing at the bottom, you may not understand what that is, but it's piping into what's called Acid Canyon. And from the lab, there was obviously waste that has accumulated. There are wastes that accumulate. And before it was allowed to be permitted as drainage into certain basins, it was just going down canyons and eroding away. Let me remind you about the actual bomb, though, right? We were picked because of the proximity of uranium, but also because this was sparsely populated, yes? Even though thousands of people lived in the areas around, not actually right there where Trinity is, but close by, right? Folks, at the time of the explosion around Tularosa, they said that windows burst, they saw a huge light in the sky, things rattled, people were flung out of bed. It just was, they thought the world was coming to an end. And they had no idea that it was coming. No warning took place. They had no idea that any sort of testing, what they were doing out there, why they were doing it. Right? They didn't even know what was going on anything. Come to find out, though, they're still paying, right? The communities, all those downwind communities, all those downstream, all those within the the pathways of drainage are all suffering. And if you're interested in what's happening with an act, it's called the RCRA, R-E-C-A, go to the Tularosa Downwinders. Martin Heinrich is also championing another bill that's supposed to get compensation for those who were exposed during and also after, and the fact that there are so many lands that have not been touched, not been tested, not really understood as far as what's happening with the fallout. I once heard a radio program that Tina Cordova from the Tularosa Downwinders put together. It was on KUNM. And she brought one of the survivors from the blast. She was a little girl who was 12 at the time and was in Mescalero Reservation. She was at a little dance camp, she said. And the girls there were thrown out of bed, out of their bunk beds at the time of the explosion. And they were told to go back to bed, everything's going to be okay. So around 8, they roll out again, and they're outside playing. There's a river that's coming by. And they start seeing this foam coming down the river, this white foam. And like children, they thought, wow, this is great. This is middle of July, and it's snowing. So they take this foam that looks something like snow, and they see ash particles coming out of the sky, and they start rubbing it all over their bodies. It's just fun for them, this foam. And she says that all the girls in that camp passed away of cancer except for one. She was a survivor of 3 different cancers. And if you go down this area, there are stories about various types of cancer, and what happens to groups is just, it's horrifying. And that is an issue that we're still dealing with, along with the amount of the abandoned mines. But also within Albuquerque's backyard is the potential to have the largest nuclear waste in the United States. Since we already have WIP, right, the nation has said, well, we can put another interim Holtec waste site in your backyard and just hold it there for, I don't know, maybe 100, 200 years, something, until we find out another place, until we determine the best location for where this high-level nuclear waste from all of the United States should come to. Now, why isn't it going in anyone else's backyard? Why is our backyard interimly appropriate is a good question, right? If you have an interest in finding out more or advocating for that not to be put in your backyard, I suggest that you go to the Nuclear Issues Study Group. Here in Albuquerque, they meet once a month at the Peace and Justice Center. Just find out what's going on. Why is this located in here? This may be part of the reasons why. Remember I told you about Los Alamos. Look at all those drainage pathways and think about every time there's a fire, the trees that have been absorbing all that water, they burn, and we all get radiation. We all inhale radiation. The dust that's there blows around. Well, when it rains, all those pathways come down, and where do they filter? Right into the Rio Grande. And where does the Rio Grande go? It's supposed to go all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. It's supposed to. Rarely does it make it there because it doesn't have enough water. And we have fights with Texas right now. But it also goes to the farmers around Hatch, right? That's our wonderful chili that we love to eat. Yeah. So when we look to the past, we have to understand that the scientific experimentation and the research that went into protecting our country for the reasons that it did has impacted communities of color. And although those scientists knew that uranium was harmful and that the effects on the human body of indigenous populations, they did not tell uranium workers, mine workers. Rural communities had no idea. And let me remind you that over 15,000 abandoned mines still exist in New Mexico. Of about 520 abandoned uranium mines, well, mine features, I'm sorry. Of the uranium mines that exist, only 2 have been somewhat cleaned up. They say cleaned up, but it's still not up to spec. And I also want to tell you that no matter how much Western medicine or traditional prayers or natural medicine or thinking positively, nothing can cure the sick and the dying from uranium exposure. I'm sure you remember Leonard Peltier. He's still in prison. And unfortunately, he sits there for reasons that are beyond control. But he's issued some statements that I find are somewhat profound. And this is his painting. You have a buffalo, which he said that in Pine Ridge there used to eat breakfast, and a buffalo would literally come up to the window every morning, steam up the window. So he was saying that stolen land, right, came about for economic reasons. And what was called worthless, if you remember once upon a time, those bad lands, those worthless mesas, there's nothing can grow out there, right? They are now suddenly very valuable for mineral resources, magically, right? Let me remind you of the scorched earth policy and the militarization. We forget about the Navajo Long Walk, about what happened in Bosque Redondo. Huelde actually means pushed aside, right? If you think about things that are put on a table and somebody just taking an arm and wiping them off, that's what huelde means. Pushed aside. If you don't understand what the Navajo Long Walk was, visit the Bosque Redondo site. They have a wonderful website. This was an internment because they wanted the hunter and gatherers to stop doing their historical practices and become like the Pueblo Indians, who were sedentary and farmers in Bosque Redondo. Anybody been out to Fort Sumner? Not a lot grows out there because it's alkaline water, which they soon found out was a failure. And when people were released from this internment, this prison camp, they settled around Fort Wingate, partially because of the rations and because it was a military base and that land parcels and some sheep were being handed out at that time. Fort Wingate began after the Indian problem was solved, right? Geronimo was locked up. People were now given parcels of land and put on reservations. Now the government really turned its focus on the new wars. In World War I, World War II, all those ammunitions were put into unexploded ordnance, these actual bombs. They had to put them in bunkers. They had to place them somewhere, and in areas that were, in case something exploded, nobody was going to get hurt. And the fact that it was in remote areas here was great, right? So Fort Wingate is located along I-40 near Gallup. These were what they call igloo bunkers, concrete. And at the time that aerial photography became something, at the time that we have satellite imagery now, it now put us in a predicament, right, with security. So ammunitions had to be demilitarized, taken out, washed out, repackaged, and put somewhere else, underground, in a mountain, in another safe location, because we are now being seen throughout the world with those two pieces of equipment. And my master's thesis at UNM focused on Fort Wingate, which was the military base. That's the area in red that looks like a strange polygon. And I was interested in this particular project because this area was repatriated back to both the Navajo and the Zuni. They both had cultural artifacts, they both had connections, they both had practices that were still continuing on these lands. And if you see, at the time that I did my project, I don't know if you can see all the little dots. Those are populated regions. And then within those dots are maybe a few that were wells. So folks, there is no fencing. Folks are able to go through here. Kids are still playing in the arroyo. And there are no signs that say, don't go in this area. The one particular area is more contaminated than the other. No. Cleanup is also not an issue because we're in a war in Iraq. That's first. We don't have money right now in our country to clean up Superfund sites, and this would be a Superfund site. And so when we're done with the wars, and maybe we'll have some money for things like restoration. So that's what I was told by the Army Corps of Engineers. There's no such thing as cleanup here. So I was saying, but you have contaminated lands here, and it's very easy to do that land suitability analysis and figure out what's going on here. And that's exactly what I did. I overlaid a map, this one here, with soils, with topography, with where the location of the contaminants were. That's the areas that are dark, that are hatched, that are black. Those that are the darkest are the most contaminated. Pretty easy, right? And then the hatching kind of goes out. The waterways I put in blue. There's wells along there. And the soils, which was my point of interest. What's happening? The ones that are in red happen to be the soils that are most permeable. The orange, a little less permeable, a little harder rock, and so on and so forth. If you notice what soils are present in the most contaminated regions, it's draining and being absorbed right into the Rio Pirkle that's running across. That's what's happening. So this was interesting because here, a lot of cultural connections, a lot of land use. There's health risks from the contaminants like mercury, lead, there's PCBs, TNT, and the exposure pathways are people actually going down there, communities living. But there's also right next to the Wingate Army Depot activity area is the old Church Rock mine. So mining started around 1918 in the Carrizo Mountains. And uranium was accidentally discovered in this area. So from World War II through the 1950s, the Vanadium Corporation and Kerr-McGee were two of the principal mine owners in the region, and they employed a lot of Navajos. Navajo men particularly came to the region or were just happy to work in the mines because they were maybe coming back from the armed services, or because the pay rate was enough to be acceptable, even though it was lower than the rest of the country, and there was need for jobs, provide for your families, right? These are actually Navajo miners. And the woman who gave me the photo for her grandfather, James Garnanez, she produced a film called Yellow Fever, and it's about uranium. So if you're interested in that, it's available, I believe, for purchase. PBS broadcasted it recently. Yellow Fever. Church Rock spill was just a couple of miles down the road from Fort Wingate. It just so happened, if you notice, the bomb at Trinity happened on July 16th, 1945. The Church Rock spill happened on July 16th, 1979. Part of my thesis was used in Winona LaDuke's book on militarization. If you're interested in that particular aspect of where is militarization happened in the United States and why, and the proximity to Native peoples, that's a great book. Let me remind you of what happened here. This was the largest uranium spill in the United States. Over 1,100 tons of uranium mine waste tailings gushed through this packed well. That's the dam. It was actually a state-of-the-art dam at the time that it broke. But like earthen dams, it obviously wasn't made to resist anything. Anyhow, these tailings gushed very early in the morning, maybe 5:40 something, and people in the neighborhood started smelling something strange. They weren't alerted for days of what actually happened, but they saw the water gushing through. And then I found this photo in the university archives, and I thought this was interesting. This is a sheep herder, Jimmy Arvizo, and the date on it was November 1979. He was on the Rio Pirkle, right, just a few months after July of the uranium spill. And the two bottom photos are Dan Budnick's photography. He came and he documented afterwards what happened with the cleanup and noted that only 50 tons of tailings were actually cleaned up. Do you remember what spilled out? Interesting. It's no accident, therefore, that the remote, sparsely populated West has been targeted in so often in many recent years by Eastern policymakers as a receptacle of deadly technological experiments. This was a consciously evolved policy, a dangerous trend in the United States that resulted in a de facto national policy of trading ecosystems, national sacrifice areas for economic gain, scientific data, and national security. This is a book that I highly recommend, and I cite it a lot in the book that I produced. My point here is that people made decisions. They disregarded certain humans for certain reasons. And who's at the table right now deciding what happens with uranium mining today? There is some interesting dialogue happening. Like I told you, the mining law of 1872 has not been changed. Permits are still being issued. And those that have already had permits are just waiting for the uranium, the cost for uranium to be affordable enough to continue again. Because Mount Taylor has not been protected in the measures that a national park status might, then it has been left open, and it's also been left uncleaned up. There are abandoned uranium mines. There's the Pueblo of Laguna, the reservoir, the waterways, in which their Pueblo has also said we have to halt our ceremonial and cultural connections right now because there's this contamination issue. It's halted their industry. It's affected their public health. And they're concerned about the future. If you're interested in some of the health effects, I highly recommend this other film called Sacred Poison. It's a 28-minute film, also available on YouTube if you're interested. It talks about a little bit more on the Arizona side, but it gives the voices of the community and the struggle with cancers that presently exist. And so I'd like to point you back towards our north, right? Just north of us in Santa Fe, in my backyard. I like this statement because we talk about cultural and historic connections. And that little blue spot are actual people. 350 did this flash flood event in which people came and they brought anything that was blue, dressed in blue, and they wanted to show what water would look like in a river. So they were advocating for a living stream, to have water for wildlife, to have a running stream instead of having it all dammed up. They felt like the landscape was dry and that they wanted this for scenic purposes, they wanted it for wildlife and recreational uses or whatnot. Anyhow, they came together and showed this as our present cultural connections, right? What's important. But we forget about the other people, about the population that is the same and comparable to Santa Fe, 70,000 people, which is the same population of the capital city here, don't have running water. Some of them don't have electricity or running water. And they're having to go to pumps. Some of them are contaminated, some are not from uranium. And it's interesting that we look at the world perspective and we note that they say water is a fundamental, right? Water is fundamental for a life of human dignity. It's a prerequisite to the realization of all other human rights. The World Health Organization. If you don't have water, you don't have life. Right? Who wants to go to a hospital that doesn't have running water? Who feels comfortable going to a school with no water? The access to water is a basic human right, according to a resolution that was passed by the United Nations. It called for the financing of resources that should be left, right, to help that basic infrastructure, that capacity, that technology. It should be that the state and the government should be stepping up so that developing countries have safe, clean, accessible, and affordable drinking water. Accessible means within 30 minutes. The reality of the situation within our own backyard, people drive 1 hour and 1 hour back to go haul water. They're called water haulers, Navajo water haulers. Sanitation, sanitation, very important for public health for all human beings, for all life, yes? So I want to remind you about those layers and the many things that we value and place as important. What happens when we combine all those things? And then we start looking at policy. We start analyzing the planning of what's happening with our future. Who's on the table and why? It's very important. Has the history and land use practices in certain regions, right, affected what we're doing, right? What cultural legacies are there to be remembered by whom, right? Was that little area once a cemetery for prisoners 100 years ago? Does it matter today? Will it matter in another 100 years? If a Walmart's placed there, should we keep that around? Those are questions that we're dealing with right now. We're planning. Should we put a nuclear dump site in an area that's that's highly infiltratable, right? That's in our recharge area, right at the base of the mountains. It's next to an acequia that's being used for farming. It's a good question to ask, right? If you don't know those layers, if you're not analyzing with all of those components put together, then are we really understanding what's happening? And the potential for what we have, right? Within our own backyard, many people are wanting to do this backyard farming thing. Do you know what's in your backyard? Here, within our backyard, it's highly contaminated. Was there an industrial plant here? Is this now a brownfield? Has it ever been cleaned up? Was there a gas leak? Is there a septic tank upstream from us? Are we asking the questions that we need? Is this important for all those other organisms that rely on it, right? Are we blocking a turtle migration path? Are we in the way of the bats? Are we using pesticides that are killing things that might help us later on in life or get us medicine? Or those ecological functions that we so desperately need? Those are the questions that I'm bringing up, that I hope that you continue this planning framework and you look at the structural changes, right? This government to government relationship that forgets about the treaty rights of the Native people who did not give up their lands, they died for it. They are living in what they're living with and how they're living as a result of what happened with those treaty rights. They're not being given the care that they need or the education that they need or that they want like they wanted, like they agreed upon, because those treaty rights have not been kept. So making sure that those structural changes honors the health and the well-being, deals with the compliance issues, right? The Pueblo of Isleta set a stricter standard, stricter than the EPA standard for arsenic, and made the Albuquerque water treatment plant clean to a certain level, which they're still not cleaning to the level that Isleta would like. But now, we've got this deregulation, even more deregulation. And those that, even though we had the wastewater treatment plant, there are still things that are coming through, like viruses, like hormones, like drugs, all kinds of things that are not being filtered out of what we drink in our tap. Can you imagine what's going down in our wastewater to communities who are using that water? And it's impacting their religious freedom and their cultural traditions that have been here for thousands of years. Are we impacting communities that are already affected by contamination by contaminating them more, right? That's a question of equity and justice. Should we be asking about access to water as a human right for all? I would. Adequate compensation for the communities and the health that's been impacted by government scientific experimentation, from private industry, from illegal dumping, from militarization? Yes, I think that needs to happen. And if you want to support things like the Tularosa downwinders, or find out how you can protect Chaco or some of the other issues, then I point you to my book that I recently wrote. It's available through Arcadia Press. You can find it on Amazon.com, at Target, Barnes & Noble, here in our backyard at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center has copies of my book. This really delves into more about the issues of contamination and how it impacts public health. So now I'm done with my presentation. Is there any time for questions?
Yes, now we've got
Okay, thank you. Thank you for listening.
Yes. So my name is Sarah Chris. I'm from the Rio River Paiute tribe over in northern Nevada. It's part of like the Great Basin region. And first of all, I love your presentation. I think it covered a lot of different components of like all of New Mexico pretty much, requiring like your environmental justice and changes that we need to make for the future. I'm also part of the Masters in Community and Regional Planning program. I'm in my second year. I'm familiar with Ted Hohola's work, so I really enjoyed the presentation as far as that goes. But my question is, I guess when you were talking about, I can't remember the name, but you were talking about an area in like New Mexico where that's going to be, could be like the place of the largest nuclear waste disposal site. What area was that?
It is just north of Isleta, Pueblo. I want to say between Mountain View and Isleta, Pueblo. There's a tract of land. And the folks that know the most about it are that Nuclear Issue Study Group. They meet right here in Albuquerque every first Wednesday. And you're welcome to attend the meeting or look online. There's a group, I'm trying to think of the coordinators. Elaine from the Community Regional Planning, she teaches environmental classes. She is on that committee. And I'm blanking on Leona Morgan, also from UNM. So those are the two main coordinators. They know the most about it. They're the ones who are trying to say, and also the governor of Isleta Pueblo, Verna, is very active about trying not to have that Holtec plant here. So Mountain View, Kirtland Air Force Base are already contaminating the aquifer there. Having a nuclear waste depository would be just unreal.
Yeah, and I know that I think it was under the Trump administration, I want to say in like January or maybe this past December, they were actually bringing back to the table, I guess back to Congress, to actually make Yucca Mountain, which is located in Nevada. That impacts the Shoshone tribes and the Paiute nations over there as the largest nuclear waste disposal site. So that, I think that in that way we kind of have those things in common. As indigenous peoples, we're constantly battling, you know, like these different disposals of like all this toxic waste and everything like that. Well, my question actually from like a planning perspective and utilizing the tools that you mentioned, like what do you think or what have you seen as far as like research goes? Like what's a sufficient proposal for where do we put this toxic waste? How do we dispose of it like properly without throwing it in somebody else's backyard, you know, or having minimal impacts? And I'm sure that's what like some government organizations are thinking. Like it's gonna have minimal impacts because it's on this remote location, it's not gonna harm anybody. Like, you know, that's probably all those proposals we've heard, but as far as like you like could learn,
yes.
Like what is a common like, you know, what would you say to people who ask that question?
Where would be the most appropriate place? Is that the question? To determine that?
Yeah.
Well, I started my master's program with a natural resource conservation track under Will Fleming, which is why I have this background in environmental science. My bachelor's was in environmental science. So with that, I have these layers of geology and hydrology and geochemistry in my brain that filters what's happening in a different way. I see what's out there and I understand that our planet is dynamic. So having that basis, there is no appropriate place because we live on a dynamic planet. Nothing's going to not shift. There's volcanic processes. We need convective processes. So if we stopped all the volcanic processes, if there weren't tectonic plate movement, our air movements, our water movements, then we would be stagnant. And then it would be safe because it would be in situ, right? In situ, right? And nothing would alter that concrete foundation. But as you know, concrete cracks. And because of land shifting, subsidence, the more that we drain upon an aquifer, there's going to be subsidence in that area. There's fracking that's happening in the Permian Basin, and around above where Carlsbad is. And the issue is that, well, it's in an area where there's just large tracts of livestock and farming going on. There's nothing out there. But there is, because what they're realizing now is that there's the caves that are the caverns, right, like Carlsbad had formed. Those are now collapsing upon each other because of the fracking. So where is there a wonderful place? I don't think there is one. What we need to do with what we've already done is a question.
Exactly, that's my question.
Los Alamos is still being allowed to and permitted to dispose of its nuclear waste, and it hasn't really developed a plan. So what we can do is push our government to really create a concrete long-term strategy, right? The long-term, which is funny for, we're talking about uranium, which is thousands and thousands and millions of years of afterlife. They're not thinking on that scale of long-term planning. But we can push them to make better decisions. I think that what's more urgent is dealing with the health disparities and to stop the contamination that's already on our land. We can cap wells that we know are contaminated. We can do something to cover up what's on the surface so it's not blowing, so we're not inhaling it, so that the San Ildefonso Pueblo doesn't, burn those trees that are irradiated and breathe that air. We can teach people, we can figure out what's happening. We can't stop forest fires, we can't stop the rain. We have to, it's in our water supply, right? How do we filter that out? We need to start thinking about those long-term planning questions. And the only thing that I can say is to push for the feasibility analysis with NEPA, because NEPA is going to say, oh, well, this one little place is secure. Nothing's going to happen because that's the perfect place for it. They're not looking at cumulative effects. They're not looking at dynamic processes within the region or the fact that this area was uplifted from volcanic activity. So Coral has volcanic activity right now. They're not taking into consideration those types of things. That's where as planners, as people who have knowledge of science can say, whoa, your science isn't sound, or you're not including these other issues. Any other questions? Sorry, that was lengthy.
No, that was perfect. 10 minutes, right? Another question? I just want to say, first of all, I was taking notes like a mad person because there's so much information in this. And having grown up in Amarillo, Texas, where there's a Pantex right there, it's like my whole life has been situated by these things. So it's incredible to see, and it makes me so happy not happy, but it's good to see public health conversations interacting with this stuff. One of my friends is from Grant County, and there's 3 people in her family who have lupus. And I know Grant County has a huge autoimmune disorder issues because of the mines down there. So this is incredible. That part was just an incredible part of your talk.
I learned from the Western Environmental Law Center. Just last week we were in a conversation, and they were bringing out a report that was recently issued about the South Valley of Albuquerque and how it has the shortest lifespan of residents in all of New Mexico. And I thought, wow, who's advocating on the health of this community? I mean, geez, something is wrong here.
Yeah, absolutely. This was amazing. Thank you guys so much for coming. I recommend getting her book because that sounds pretty cool.
I do have some books if you're interested.